Any casual Bible reader will recognize that periodically the scriptures allow inanimate objects to speak to us. When you read the book of Genesis, you hear in chapter 4, the scriptures tell us that it is the blood of slain Abel that speaks to God from the earth. When you read the New Testament, Mark chapter 6, you can hear Jesus say to the disciples that if you go into a city where your message is not received, shake the dust off your sandals as you depart, and that dust will become a testimony against those who would not hear. Later on, as you work through the New Testament, you see Jesus say to a group of people who refuse to give him worship, that if you don't praise me, the rocks will cry out. Because you see throughout the Bible inanimate objects speaking, articulating, saying what it is we ought to understand as they testify against what it is we know or should know. Now James has come to a place where he is using a similar kind of skill in helping people to understand something about this God, how he views oppression, mistreatment, and abuse. And notice inside verse 1 of chapter 5 a shift in the way that even James is talking. Here in verse 1 he says, "Look here, you rich people, weep and groan with anguish because of all the terrible troubles ahead of you. Your wealth is rotting away, and your fine clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have become worthless. The very wealth you were counting on will eat away your flesh like fire. This treasure you have accumulated will stand as evidence against you on the day of judgment." And notice something. This is still James. James had been talking to us in these practical, applicable ways. In fact, the entire book of James is about how to apply Christian practices in a way that makes sense. You remember, James was not lofty and celestial. James had brought it down, granddaddy would say. He brought the hay down where the goat could get it. He got to a place where he was speaking practically so that they could understand something about how it was God wanted them to live. But now James is shifting in the way that he's talking. He's not speaking practically anymore. In verses 1 throughout in chapter 5, James has now gone into his prophetic mode. He is now making declarations that are hard for anybody to hear, but specifically for those who would have been a part of the upper crust, the elite. James is now literally railing on them, saying that it's too late to change your behavior. This is not a call to change behaviorally. This is now a declaration, a prophetic declaration that the end is coming and you cannot escape it. When I hear James begin to speak like this, the thing that sort of amazes me is that James has a unique way of using his rhetorical skill to get a point across, which is why we want to hear the way at least James talks as a precursor. It's because James has come to a place where he realizes, you know what? I've seen enough abuse, I've seen enough oppression, that now I want to deal with that as an issue and speak as clearly as I need to so that those who need to hear it can get the message, and those who need to be comforted can find solace in their day of affliction. I raise this because sometimes what happens is people use two different models of communicating, both that can be sinful. You see, when you gossip, you are talking about people, you are saying things behind their back that you would not say to their face. That's called gossip, and that's a sin. But then when you flatter, you are saying things to people's face that you would not say behind their back. And so whether you are gossiping or whether you are flattering, you are still sinning. James has come to utilize a rhetorical skill called apostrophe, in which he is talking about the rich even though they are not there, so that the poor can find hope and realize that their condition has not been abandoned, they have not been forgotten. And I dare say that if you live in the 21st century, every now and then you feel like something is up. God, do you hear me? When you look at the ancient world, we're not talking about anybody in this church. We're not talking about anybody in Coatesville. We're not even talking about anybody within 50 miles of here. Why? Because we're not talking about that kind of rich. You see, the kind of rich I'm talking about that James was dealing with in the ancient world, there were three ways to be rich. It was either gold, it was either grain, or it was garment. You had to have an accumulation of one of the three. Some in his day had so much grain until the grain rotted before it could be eaten and had to be thrown away. Some had so much gold that it was piled up so high that the glimmer of gold resting on the bottom over time had begun to tarnish. Some had so many garments that there were moths and insects eating away at the wool clothing. And so James was talking about a kind of opulence that we know nothing about. James was talking about a kind of greed and a kind of possession that sometimes we look at and envy, but we've got to be careful lest we adopt a 50-cent theology of get rich or die trying, and miss that the idea of accumulating great wealth without an understanding that all of it belongs to God is still sin. So that the goals of our lives, when they are shaped by the culture, are antithetical. What's that mean? They're against, they're contrary to what God says. And anybody who just wants to get rich to be rich loses sight of the fact that the only reason why money is given is not to be a possession, it's to be used. The problem here is that James wants to get at a kind of greed that is insidious. It is incarnate not only in people who have, but it's also ingrained in poor folks. Because there are poor people who are as greedy as rich people. You see, when the only reason why you're going to eat it is because it's free, not because you're hungry, you just greedy. When you have clothes in the closet that still have tags on it. When you have food in the cupboard that you have to throw away because it's expired. It means you have too much. And you are as greedy as the billionaire. Lord, I wish I had somebody. Very few of us in the house are poor. I'm talking about poor, Haiti poor. Rwanda poor, Congo poor. I'm not saying we couldn't use a little more cheddar. I get it. You want to be able to pay your bills. You want to be able to go on vacation. There's nothing sinful about that. But the truth is that you can be poor and still abuse the money and the things that God has given, because the money God gives is not for you to play the lottery. And the money God gives is not for you to make it rain. You see, in the strip clubs, there ain't nothing but a bunch of poor folks. And if you don't know what it means to make it rain, ask somebody laughing sitting next to you. How you going to be flicking $1 bills in the sky knowing you got to pay the gas bill? How you going to make it rain in a strip club and can't pay the cable bill? You just as greedy and just as exploitive as the rich billionaire. Am I making sense to anybody? James said, no, there's a way in which it is too late now, and I'm talking to you because I want you to hear that if you're not careful, you will make the same mistake as the filthy rich and be as greedy as they are and still miss what it is God calls you to be and incur his wrath and incur his judgment. That's what James is getting at. James says if you're not careful, you can be broke, and in being broke, still be just as greed-oriented as those who have. And I want to be careful here. You see, we will talk about the ways in which unfair practices have hurt people. Look at this text. He says, for listen here, verse 4, the cries of the field workers whom you have cheated of their pay. The wages you held back cry out against you. The cries of those who harvest your fields have reached the ears of the Lord of heaven's armies, or the Lord of hosts. Notice James says, you know what? There's a prioritization that you'll miss if money is the only goal. You see, there is this way in which he's trying to say to those who have been brutalized, keep your head up. Listen, God has heard. God hears when you are cheated. God hears when you are oppressed. God hears when you are abused. And God pays attention to the abused and the abuser. The tendency is to say, you know what, I'll take matters into my own hands. I'll do whatever it is I need. No. There's two sins here in the text. See, the first sin is when I, for instance, by way of illustration, if I am racist, I can be racist all by myself, and that would be sinful. I could be racist all by myself, live in my isolated cocoon, and that would still be sinful because in many ways I'm demeaning someone else. But if I, as a racist, open a business, and now because I'm a racist, decide in my business that I will not serve or will not allow people to participate fairly, or if I decide that I'll hire people in my business, but because I'm a racist, I'll pay them less. Now I've taken my sin and superimposed it on somebody else, and now I'm not just sinful, now I am an oppressor. I'm an abuser. If I'm just racist all by myself, that's one thing. But when I take my racism and superimpose it on somebody else, or let's use it another way. Let's say I'm just selfish. As long as I'm selfish and self-centered all by myself, it means others don't get the spill of my sinfulness. But if in my selfishness what I do is bring people into me and cheat them and disrespect them, now my sin is being superimposed on them, and now I got to deal with God, not just for my sin personally, but the way I've handled other people. And people who are abused sometimes feel like there's nobody speaking up for them, that they have no options. That's why when people lose a job because they have been unjustifiably dismissed, when people realize that they have been cheated and they know they have been cheated, they feel like there's nobody looking out for their best interests. When a woman has been abused by a man or vice versa, or a child has been abused by a parent, or a someone who is in submission to someone else abused by someone in oversight, there is a tendency that God is not listening and God is not watching. I'm telling you, the text says he's always looking out for the abused. He's always looking out for the oppressed. And he's always looking to deal with the oppressor and the abuser. Now, here's where you want to be careful. It is easy to transpose this picture to somebody else. But let me be very clear to you that when you go out to a restaurant to eat, if you can't afford to tip generously, then you can't afford to eat out. I am tired of watching people go to restaurants on Sunday dressed up like Christians where we know you just came from church. Still got the hat on, still got the suit on, still got the dress on. And when it's time to tip the person who works for peanuts, instead of you being lavish and generous, you cheat them because of the service they have rendered, and you make excuses like, well, I didn't like the service. Well, guess what? Then find another restaurant where you do like the service. But don't penalize them and accept their service and then cheat them in the process. And for God's sake, don't leave them a track. I've been to dinner with Christian people who will leave $1 and a track. And if you ask service industry workers, like at the country buffet, do you like working on Sundays? What they will say is no. I try to avoid Sundays. Why? Because when church people come in after church, they the meanest, most cantankerous, disrespectful, and cheap folks we ever get during the weekend. People who get done partying on Friday and Saturday night tip better than God's people. Now, if you can't tip generously, then don't accept the waiter's labor and then cheat them in the tip. Because that's you in the text. Accepting their service and then ripping them off in the tip. And if you've ever waited tables, if you've ever had to serve people, you know how nasty people can be. James said, no, I want you to realize that there is a speaking voice that abuse has, that God hears. That God hears the abused, and God is always paying attention to the abuser. He says, and you need to be paying attention to it because there's a priority about how you want to live in a way that avoids being oppressive and participating in oppression. But he goes further. Here's what he says. He says, look, the wages you held back cried against you. The cries of those who harvest your fields have reached the ears of the Lord of heaven's armies. And you have spent your years on earth in luxury, satisfying your every desire. You have fattened yourselves for the day of slaughter. You have condemned and killed innocent people who do not resist you. It's not accidental that he jumps into verse 7 where he says, dear brothers and sisters, be patient as you wait for the Lord's return. And I'll talk about that as I close. But I wanted you to be able to see this is not the natural division. This would have been all together. James is going at something. He wants them to prioritize how they see themselves in the pursuit of their goals of life. And wealth is not the end goal if it does not glorify God. He also wants them to be very clear that there's a kind of patience that they've got to exert as God is listening, as God is looking, and as they are speaking, because there's a danger when you're abused and oppressed to speak offhand and miss that God has still called us to a posture of waiting for him and watching for him to act. You see, the temptation is that you will take matters into your own hands. And the problem with that is that you will always act prematurely and out of your own flesh as opposed to waiting for God who has heard and now turning your attention to the God and speaking to him about your situation as opposed to taking it into your own hands to fix it. And so James is trying to warn them in this way. He's not only saying, look who's talking, look who's listening. Because there's a God who hears, and this is where he gets to as he moves to the end of this verse. He says that this is the Lord of, at the end here, verse 4, he says, those cries have reached the ears of the Lord of heaven's armies, which is a strange place to see that utilized in the New Testament. You say, why, Williams? Because Lord of heaven's armies is another defined expression that usually you find only in the Old Testament. And it is translated Lord of hosts. Usually you don't see the description of Yahweh as Lord of heaven's armies, Lord of hosts in the New Testament. Rarely. Lord of hosts was an Old Testament term used because throughout the Old Testament there was a preoccupation with misery, with a need for protection, with a need to be defended, with a need for God's guidance. There was an assault on Old Testament participants that utilized the term Lord of hosts, Lord of armies in ways that was most necessary for the Old Testament than you would see it in the New Testament. And so James uses this term, interestingly enough, because what he wants them to understand is that there is a coming reckoning, but you're going to have to watch and you're going to have to wait because God is still in control. He's the Lord of hosts. He's the Lord of everything. He's the Lord of famine. He's the Lord of fever. He's the Lord of people. He's the Lord of politics. He's the Lord of power. He's the Lord of greatness. He's the Lord of those who would use their greatness and their power to oppress. He's saying to them, I want you to hold on. I want you to hang in, because this God, this Lord of heaven, is still fighting for you. You are never on your own. You are never abandoned. You are never by yourself. But there's some stuff you got to watch for, because there are some things worth waiting and watching for. When I was a kid growing up, my mother used to bake cakes. But she actually made cakes. She actually made a cake without necessarily going to a box. And the problem for me was she would make the cake, make the batter, then let me lick the spoon. By the time I got done licking the spoon, I was ready to eat cake. But she said the cake's got to go into the oven. I said, how long does this have to take? She said, it's going to be a while. Do you remember back in the day when you couldn't run through the house? Because what they said was, if you run through the house, you'll make the cake drop. Oh, come on. All right, let me talk to some older people who, if you ran through the house, the cake would fall. So I remember I'd start running because I was ready to eat cake. She'd say, hey, slow down. You're going to make my cake fall. And I remember waiting, and I'm not sure how long it took to bake a cake, but as far as I was concerned, it might have been like an 8-hour job, because I could not believe that it took that long. But what she would do is eventually take it out, sit it on the top of the thing, and say, listen, you can look at it, but it's got to cool. I'm thinking that's got to be torture to a 7-year-old to make you wait for the cake and then let you look at the cake and tell you you can't touch it because it's got to cool. But here's what I discovered. After the first slice, maybe the second slice, I realized, you know what? This joint was worth waiting for. Sometimes that's what God does. God says, I know you're in a hurry. I know you want me to fix it right now. I know you want me to change the situation right now. But slow down. Stop running. Just wait. And if you wait for me, you'll find out that the Lord of hosts, I wish I had a witness. You'll find out that the Lord of heaven's armies, you'll find out that if you just wait on God, it will be worth waiting for. Do I have a witness? If you let God work it, if you let God fix it, if you let God handle it, He is worth waiting for. You don't have to be in a hurry. He's heard. He's listening. And He will handle it if you wait on Him. And you'll discover that prayer will change every need you've got. Prayer is the wonderful thing that, let's put it this way, there's no need you've got that prayer can't handle. That's what he's saying in 7. There's no need. He runs the gauntlet of needs. There's no need that prayer cannot resolve. If you will wait patiently and trust God to do what God wants to do. And this morning, beloved, be encouraged. Wait on Him. He's listening. Look who's talking. Wait on God to do what God wants to do.